Okay, I decided to be a pain in the butt to the camera people and walk around because I got this mic here that I can walk around with. But first of all, this is amazing. What a great turnout. This is the first meeting, first sort of get-together, public get-together on campus, and it's wonderful. I truly believe as a communication school, and those of you who don't know, I usually teach in the marketing communication department the lower level courses, the entry level courses, and usually get a lot of students who come in and think that they're going to get into the fashion industry and the entertainment industry and go to great parties and drive cool cars and hang out with all the stars and date Britney Spears and then we get to the second week of the course in MH200, which is Communication, Media, and Society, and we talk about who owns the media. And we talk about how the media works as an industry and as a for-profit industry. And by that time, I get people coming to my office that week and saying, oh my God, I don't know if I want to do this with my life. So it's important that, A, we know about the media, we know what's happening in the media, we know how the industry is set up, and it's also important to know what we can do to make it better as individuals and as a community. And that's what S.C.A.M.M is all about, and that's why it's so important. And it goes across all schools on campus. Or the two schools we have on campus, across departments, it definitely goes. It can be used certainly in the School of the Arts and the School of Communications, all coming together for the betterment of media. We have some wonderful panelists here tonight to discuss. I'm going to leave the forum open to them, but we want it to be a free-form discussion tonight as well. So feel free. We'll have a standard Q&A at the end, but feel free if you have a question in the middle of while we're talking about something to go ahead and come to the microphone and ask a question, okay? Or just raise your hand and talk, whatever. We're Emerson students. We can talk loud from our seats. First, let me introduce our panelists here tonight, who are experts in the field of media studies and media literacy and media criticism, I would gather, too. First, from Project Think Different at the end of the table there, Kumwa Swati. And then closer to me here from Free Press, Rustin. So let's get it started. Guys, I thought we'd start by defining the problem in media today. And I know it's huge and it might take days, but let's put it in a nutshell. Kumba, let's start with you. Define the problem, and let's get the discussion going in that way.
Well, I think one of the major things that we have to think about as far as the media is concerned is just media conglomeration. I think one of the strongest trends that we've seen is all of the smaller media outlets being bought up by larger organizations. And I mean, I think I was eavesdropping on a conversation that you were having up front just about that similar thing. And one of the things that we're seeing with that is a narrowing of the discourse around what's going on in our society. And I think that's one of the most fundamental things that we have to look at for changing the paradigm on. One of the things that I've kind of had this epiphany on as I talk to people about media is that we've got all these media outlets that are able to send out all this kind of information in such high quality with such great skill, technical skill, creative skill, and it's all set to go in one direction. And that kills me. That just kills me, because if we're really talking about living in a democratic society, it has to go back and forth. It can't just go in one direction, and it can't be just coming from people who don't serve our needs and don't have needs that are like ours. Because the people who are running these organizations are capitalist capitalists who their only interest is to have their own bottom line supported. Okay, they're in it for the money. They're not necessarily in it for the growth of democracy within the society. And some of them will just plain and simple tell you that. I mean, and I just love. I think it was one of the internal memos kind of pulled out of Disney, where Michael Eisner was saying, They don't have any responsibility to really changing society or really doing anything for anybody. Their main goal is to make money. And that's Disney is the one that we all go in awe. We're all in awe about, or maybe not us, but so much of the society is in awe of Disney. And their only goal is to make money. Now they'll, in the way they relate to us, it's a whole lot, it's a lot of a different story. But we have to be able to see through that. We really have to be able to see through the things that they show us and what they really mean. So I think that media conglomeration and what that means for our society is one of the really important issues that we have to think about, and one of the things that we have to start to chip away at. And there's a lot of ways to do that.
Thank you, Russ.
Pardon the clearing of throat. I'd like to reiterate a point that he made, and I completely agree. It's that media conglomeration is possibly the greatest threat to our media facing us today. Now, let's step back even another few paces. Why do you have this? In general, we have this because for too long, for decades, really since the very beginnings of our broadcast system here in the United States, people, the very folks who depend on the media to decide, to get all their sources of information, to figure out who they're going to vote for in the upcoming elections, they've been completely and utterly cut out of the policy-making process. 2 years ago, when the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, voted 3-2, 3 Republicans to the 2 Democrats, to loosen decades of public interest protections, media ownership protections, to allow one entity to own monopoly cable company in your town, monopoly newspaper in your town, 8 radio stations, and 3 of the local television stations we're talking, one person having ABC, NBC, and the Fox broadcaster in the area. There's a reason for that, and the reason is that for too long you, as citizens, and just as ordinary folks, have been told this issue is way too complex for you to understand. And in the meantime, from 1998 to 2004, $222 million has been spent by the media industry to curry favor with lawmakers. The media industry is probably the most powerful lobbying force in D.C. for a number of reasons. One, they have a number of deep pockets. We're talking an industry here that defines failure as not getting a 15% return on investment. The problem is not we're going under. The problem is Michael Eisner couldn't get his yacht this year. All right. Problem number 2, the media is also the gateway through which your legislators are going to reach their constituents. There's an extra little carrot hanging before them. It should be noted that before that vote went down at the FCC officials met with industry officials 71 times. 71 times in 2003 leading up to this vote to loosen media ownership rules. Folks from the other side, that being your side, only got 5 opportunities to meet with FCC officials. And to the extent there was public debate, the FCC consented to having only one public meeting. One public meeting held in Richmond during a snowstorm, just a mere month or 2 before the vote went down. It was populated entirely, vast majority with industry representatives, none of whom brought a news camera to report what was going on. This is the base problem, and the more that you get involved with media policy, the more likelihood there is that public interest values are going to find their way back into the policies that shape our media. Because many people, so many folks that we talk to across the country have this perception that the way our media exists today is natural, that market forces made it the way it is, that the reason it exists today, the reason everything is so hyper-commercialized, the reason that certain communities are outright misrepresented or maligned entirely is because it's the best of all possible worlds anyway. It can't really get that much better than this, and the truth is that it couldn't be further from the truth. Those who shape what the policies are that make up our media shape what our media looks like. If you change the policies, you'll change the media.
Thank you. If we get a little bit more specific, we put it in a nutshell. If you guys have to name, in terms of conglomerates, the biggest perpetrators, what comes up usually in my class with News Corp and Fox here in this country as being the biggest perpetrators of sort of the conglomeration and the politicizing to the right of mass media. Who are, and Disney comes up as well, who are the biggest problems specifically? Russ, why don't we start with you?
Well, as far as as far as our media is concerned, the top five, the five groups that determine the vast majority of what you see, hear, and read every day. It amounts to Viacom, which owns CBS amongst a number of other properties, Disney, which owns ABC amongst a number of properties, General Electric, which owns NBC amongst a slew of other properties, News Corporation, which is Fox amongst a slew of other things, and Time Warner, which owns CNN amongst a number of things. Now, it's got to be the reason I can list those off the top of my head is because I'm that big a dork. But it's got to be remembered that all these folks, not only do they have media interests, they also have interests in all sorts of other industries. I mean, GE, for instance, not only sells Fruit Loops and other things across their airwaves, but they also happen to sell jet engines and battle tanks. Disney has interests in oil and gas, and one wouldn't be going too far off the mark to wonder when an armed conflict might cause stock values of your holdings to go up, or if you're actually in the business of selling implements of war, if you're not going to use your news department to possibly sell a war, period. You're not necessarily unreasonable in thinking about that.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly with what Russ has said, and actually I would almost be remiss if I said that there was one in particular that was any worse than any other. And yeah, I can point to Fox and Viacom. I mean, I think about Viacom because for a while I was teaching an introduction to mass communications course, at the College of Louisville Institute of Art. And, I was wondering why, when I turned to one page, there was this whole write-up on Viacom. It had all of its holdings, things like that. And so, I was looking through the book a little bit more, and I realized that it was put out by Viacom. Okay. And I was recently sent another media book, in the mail, by a publishing company. And I think it was about media and democracy. And I said, oh, this is great. Wow, this could be really good. And I started reading it, and I said, boy, this is pretty lame. And again, I look at who's putting out this book. It's Viacom. So like you're saying, they're not only in there, to put out MTV and other things like that, but they're out there to shape the opinions that we have even about them. And I think it's really insidious, and we really have to look at that, and that this is a trend that goes through all of these media conglomerates. They're like children fighting in a sandbox. They all want the same thing. They all want the same amount of toys, and they're all going to fight each other for them. And if one gets bigger, they're going to say, "Oh, this guy shouldn't have as much." And I say guys because it's usually men who are running these organizations. It's something to think about too. But I don't think there's anyone that we can point at. But I'm sure on any given day, we could point at Fox, or we could point at Viacom, or GE, or Disney, that kind of thing.
Sure. In terms of product, these media conglomerates produce media products. What is the common thread and the message and the images that most constitute these products? What do these products say to the public other than just consume? What are they telling us? And completely start with you.
Yeah, I would say number one is don't think about it. Okay, we're going to present you with information. You don't have to think about it. It reminds me of, I love water. I think water is a great thing. And I think we've learned nothing about water, from the media. And I remember a news piece that talked about water toxicity. It was around the time that the marathon was around. And from what I know about water toxicity, that doesn't happen very often, where you get too much water. But they were talking about how this person had gotten too much water in their system, and now they're in the hospital. And then, very conveniently, at the end of the news piece, the last two shots are somebody drinking Gatorade. I said, "Oh, that's really interesting. Why is it that we're going to see Gatorade at the end of a water ad? Actually, I'm sorry, news piece. So it was really interesting, but that always comes to mind. And I think that one of the things that we don't get is truth about what's out there. And it's very simple things that we don't understand. Things like water, things like food, things like politics, which should be pretty simple, are made to be very complex, or we're given a very narrow concept of what that thing is. And we don't really understand what it is, so we have to go find that kind of information when the assumption is that we're getting all we need from the media, because they're so powerful, they're so strong, they're so great, of course, okay? Because they give us these glitzy images, things like that. But again, we're getting some very narrow kinds of ways of looking at our world. And and some very narrow ways of looking at ourselves. One of my greatest punching bags is Disney. And I was talking to my students about how all the women have waists shaped like this, like a V. And all the men, that are of any import have necks like tree trunks. And I'm like, why is that? Why is that the case, that all women have to have literally unhealthy, physically impossible waistlines? Why is that, the abiding image of women? And I think in a lot of other shows, and I think one of my other favorite worst shows is The Swan. And I hope you all hate it just like I do. Because I think it's horrible that we would trot women across a stage and literally cut them to shreds and say that this is our idea of how we create beauty or create value in women. So again, we have some very narrow kinds of things that are being presented about who we're supposed to be. And I think that's one of the most dangerous things, because we start to believe it. Even if we're not spitting out the same words, we start to go along with it, or we start to say, yeah, that's acceptable. And I literally almost threw a conniption fit, when I brought in a tape about the Swan into one of my classrooms, and one of the guys said, well, yeah, she was kind of ugly. I didn't know what to say to the man. I really didn't know what to say, and I was kind of like literally doing this. I said, I can't believe you said that. I really can't believe you said that. They're about to cut her to shreds now, because, and you go along with this. So I think that's a really dangerous trend, and you have to watch out for what the media suggests to us is okay.
So you want to touch on that media products and the messages and the images that they portray?
Yeah, well, as far as to build on that answer, you have to ask yourself, who are they actually catering to? And especially when it comes to the broadcast networks and broadcasting in general, the main audience isn't you. The main audience is not you as a person out there. The people that commercial networks are serving are the advertisers. That's who their customer is. You are basically the product. What broadcasters do is sell you to advertisers. So the kinds of products that you're going to see on TV are the very things that advertisers believe are going to bring you to that program to watch their advertisement. And one of the gravest travesties, one of the greatest casualties of this is local news, an oxymoron these days. When's your media supposed to be serving you at its best? When do you need it? And I'd say that's elections. And a study that was recently done, that you just read about last week and just dying to talk about with people, University of Wisconsin, the University of Southern California did an analysis of what local news, what it looked like between October 4th and November 1st, 2004. They looked at a variety of markets, and they came up with a number of really astounding results. Chief among these is that obviously local politics, advertisers believe, is not profitable, and this is borne out by the results of all the broadcasts that they watched. Only 8% of them included any information about a local race. Now, when I say a local race, I'm talking about that includes campaigns for the United States House of Representatives, the United States Senate, the state Senate, the mayor, city council, judgeships, local law enforcement posts, education-related offices, and regional offices, you name it. If you had 100 news programs and you missed the 8 that had a 30-second piece about one of these particular elections, you went to the ballot box with no information whatsoever. There was 8 times more coverage about accidental injuries than there was about all local races combined. There were 12 times more coverage on sports and weather than all local races combined. And then in Los Angeles, not one story was ever aired on their local media about a House of Representatives race. And even more astounding, in Seattle, possibly one of the closest elections that we've had in years. It was decided by 129 votes. Millions of people voting, 129 votes. Only 5% of the broadcasts had any information about that governor's race in Washington. And in fact, Seattle stations delivered 14 times more coverage of teasers. We're talking like, Fluffy, the water skiing squirrel coming up later after 3 muggings, 1 arson, and weather. 14 times more of that than there was coverage of the governor's race. This is a travesty. And I guess the collective wail you sometimes hear coming from Northampton a ways out where we're based, that generally happens when someone comes into our office and reminds us that even with all the technology that we have, the vast majority of Americans still get the majority of their news and information from local news sources. It gives us all the collective shudder of doom.
And one thing that reminds me of is, is when Ralph Nader was trying to get into the debate at UMass some years back. I thought it was unbelievable that we didn't see that. That first of all, that he wasn't allowed in. Where he was, I think, running for president, right? I think so, right? Isn't that what was happening? So, but for some reason, I think that's what it was. But maybe I might not know because they didn't even cover that. I mean, I met people on the street in Harvard Square who were there and said what a in a sense, a freak show it was. That they were keeping him out. And I remember, that much footage being shown on that, and that was a serious issue. And it also reminds me of the last election where the only place I saw anybody other than Kerry and Bush was on Bill Moyer's Now. He actually had a couple of shows where he had at least up to, I guess, 4 total of all the other candidates that were actually out there running for president. I think I might have been weeping when I saw this, because I said, oh my God, that's right, there are other people running for president. There's other choices that we have, but how would we know?
It's always important to look back at the history of this. How the heck did we get here? I'll just ask it that simply. How the heck did we get here with media, which is a relatively new form of communication if you look back at the history of the world?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to the, and I agree with what you say about market forces, and I think that there's definitely some of that though that kind of impacts how we got to be how we are today with the media. And I shouldn't say we are, because we sort of have nothing to do with the way it is right now, and that's part of the problem. But I think very early on when TV first began, they didn't even realize what kind of power it had, and I think the advertisers really started to see that. Hey, wait a minute, we can really get our products across to so many people very, very quickly, and it was developing over time. I mean, TV, the way it first started out, is very different from the way it is now, as you might know. And one of the things I like to do is get some of these old DVDs of the old TV broadcasts, things like that. They're all in black and white. But there's such a difference today in what we see and just how the advertisers and the money organizations have really taken control of the media because they started to understand what power it had, and they have the ability, like you're saying, to hold sway in the government, and they're really in bed with each other, to a degree that it's really sinful, it's really awful, and how we are not included in that discourse about what should happen with one of the most important processes that a society can have, how we talk to each other about what's important to us. And again, I always think about water. How come we don't see any TV shows where people, after talking about the last date they have, they just kick back with a drink of water? How come it's Coca-Cola? Or how come in what was it, Zoolander? There was a Starbucks cup that was spinning toward the camera, as the gas station blew up. How many of you saw Zoolander? Okay, cool. I thought it was a lot of fun, but it's completely full of product placements, and it really reminds us how much these advertisers are really getting in. I mean, I think what was it? E.T. was one of the first to take advantage of that. Eating was it Reese's Pieces, I think, and I forget it. I think it might have been M&M's or somebody who had passed on that. And I'm sure there was a few executives who were never going to work again in that business, because they passed up on that. But the advertisers have really started to, take control of this process, not only because they see the power of the media, but because they've been able to take control and use their influence within the government that regulates a lot of how it's done. And part of that process is the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which also did a lot to really break down a lot of the earlier controls that had been put into the system, so that it was actually more of a system that could be used by us and that would serve our purposes. That was the initial goal, but again, that got subverted over the years.
I'll even go back further than that. I'll say the reason we are where we are is because of where we really started. Let's go back to the dawn of radio, where a lot of these precedents were set. In the mid-20s, when radio was truly flourishing, we're talking a makeup of about a third of the stations that existed at the time were non-commercial entities. They were just sort of, Jim Bob down the street happened to have access to a transmitter and was transmitting. Then you had a number of folks who were running stations out of their brick and mortar business. So, Billy Joe down the street happened to have an auto shop, and he ran a radio station upstairs, or he happened to mention the auto shop, but these weren't being run for commercial purposes. It was largely for promotion of that one business, but they weren't making money per se from broadcasting. There was a very, very tiny sliver at that time of folks who were in fact trying to sell advertising, and were quickly realizing that perhaps there was a lot of money to be made if you were able to make this thing go big. So in fact, surveys in the mid-20s, people were asked, how do you feel about advertising? And overwhelmingly, the public said, advertising sucks. We don't like it. We don't want it. I don't want to listen to it. Lee DeForest, who was one of the pioneers of radio, spent his time inventing devices to try and wipe out advertising a la the TiVo. So what happens? 1927, 1928, federal government convenes the Federal Radio Commission to try and see if there was some way to divvy up the airwaves, because everyone was starting to interfere with each other. It wasn't really a good mechanism and process. From where did they draw the folks who filled the Federal Radio Commission? This is the commission that eventually would become the Federal Communications Commission. Well, they drew engineers from the folks who were doing commercial broadcasting, that very, very small percentage of stations that were in fact making money from selling advertising. What you see happen between 1928 and 1932 is you see a number of orders come down where they say, okay, folks, every 3 months, if you happen to be conflicting with somebody, then you're going to come see us, we'll work it all out. So you saw commercial stations starting to butt up against, Jim Bob's Calvary Church station. You'd have to spend some money to go to D.C., spend money to actually argue your case in front of them, and the FCC decided, the Federal Radio Commission, decides, okay, if you're a commercial station, you're obviously, since you're beholden to advertising and whoever happens to get the best ratings is obviously what the public wants. But if you're a nonprofit station, if you're just, out there, you're not selling advertising, you must be a propaganda station. A number of engineers coming from commercial broadcasting that was just beginning to burgeon at the time, making this decision. So what you see happen is, over the course of that 4 years, boom, commercial network A bumps up against nonprofit network B. Federal Radio Commission sits back and says, okay, commercial network, you are not a propaganda station, so you guys get 9 a.m. until 3 in the morning, and you guys get 3 in the morning until 6 in the morning, and such until 1932, where basically you see non-commercial broadcasters, community people, churches, just ordinary folks who had discovered radio, sent all the way to the fringes, and pretty much the new networks cemented in stone by the Communications Act of 1934. Communications Act of 1934 was essentially the broadcasters who now realized that advertising is a $100 million a year business, deciding, okay, what we want to do is make sure that there's no more chance that the public might come to Congress and say, I kind of liked the non-commercial broadcasting because it talked about stuff I care about in my community. So they created and set in stone the Federal Communications Commission. Any of these issues will get settled in committee, hopefully out of public view. The Communications Act of 1934 cements that into place, and that's your precedent going forward. Now, other countries made different decisions. Britain in the 1920s decided they were going to put public interest values ahead of commercial ones. They invented the BBC, and they said, okay, we're going to put big restrictions on commercial broadcasting. Canada was figuring out what to do with their radio spectrum after we had already established a predominantly commercial system, and Britain had established the BBC. Lee DeForest writes a letter to the Canadian committee that was coming up with what they were going to do and says, please God, don't do what we did. Save yourselves now while you can. And they did. They decided we were absolutely crazy. And there's amazingly funny quotes from the BBC at the time where they said that they couldn't fathom the American system. It's a specifically American version of democracy they've set up here. So these are the kinds of precedents that we have moving forward. Now, the reason these precedents got set so hard was because you had this new technology at that time that was outpacing policy. And the amazing thing is we have a brief window right now where technology is once again outpacing policy. You have this grand internet experiment going on right now. We're seeing where that goes. Mid-90s, people were asked survey, do you want advertising on the internet? People resoundingly said, advertising sucks. Look at it now. Is it advertising because that's what market forces wanted? No, it's largely because in the early 90s, When the internet was still part of the federal government, still funded by public money, they set themselves in the Muhaha room at Harvard with a bunch of burgeoning telecommunications and internet companies, and the internet companies basically came out and said, it's unfair that we have to compete against you, the federal government, in the maintenance of this internet thing. So we should just make the thing commercial, and everybody agreed, that is fine. We will do the same thing, following, of course, on the precedent that radio did years ago. So the next few years, this Telecommunications Act that he speaks of, indeed, it's going to go through a rewrite. We have about 3 or 4 years right now of a window where you can make your voices heard and see if we can't get some of those more public interest-oriented values into media policy making, lest the debates stay behind closed doors amongst industry and government officials and end up with basically decades and generations of assurance that the internet will not be the way it is now, that it will be completely dominated by commercial forces and all that entails. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. So,
If you guys want to, yeah.
if you all want to.
When we make a statement, and you and Ross could just respond to this statement. So it's not necessarily a question, but let me make this statement. Media has superseded family, community, and religion as the main socialization force in our society today.
Yes and no. I agree and I don't agree. I think that, again, the media never forced anyone to do anything, very directly. But there's a function of media that is all about repetition. And with media conglomeration, we're seeing the repetition of some very insidious messages and the lack of some very important messages across the board, through print work, through TV, radio, internet, video games, all kinds of different media, advertising, of course, in all areas. And so, yes, there's a lot of information that's coming out through the media around socializing us to certain things. There's, it's this maybe, this, I don't know if I want to call it a new age. I would hope this is the old age of media. But that at this time, we're able to have something go out throughout the media, and the next day we can all be talking about it in the schools, in the hallways, at the water coolers and things like that. So it holds a very powerful place for us that all of a sudden there's this body of information that we have together. There's this common knowledge, and I use that really loosely. When we get information from media, but there's this common knowledge that we have, and these trends that are suggested to us about how we should treat each other, how we are to look at each other as men and women, as people from different nationalities, things like that. Or if you're a red stater or a blue stater, how we're supposed to look at each other, things like that. So I think there's some really powerful socializing forces that are put into play by the media. I also think there's some very important socializing forces put into play by a family or around a dinner table. I think there's some very important social forces that are put into play by a brother, by a big brother and a little brother. I think there's some very important social forces being put into play in schools. Which ones are winning out? I think we might be able to point toward the media and say that the media is making some suggestions that we're tending to go along with. But I think one of the things is that we're allowing ourselves to be swayed by these things. I'm not saying it's completely across the board and 100%. I love it when I hear people don't have a TV in their house, or they never watch TV anymore. They can't stand to listen to talk radio or something like that. That's completely fine. Even though I've produced TV and I teach TV, when I hear people say they don't even watch TV, I love it. I hug them right then and there. I think that's a fine thing. It's a dangerous little box, and you need to know how to handle it. And you got to remember where the off button is. That's the most important part of the TV, the off button. But so I think there's some very important socializing forces that do happen through the media, but we cannot forget that we are our own most important socializing force, and we have to remember how to enact that and what that means, that we have to communicate with each other. And again, that's one of the things that the media doesn't do for us. It doesn't help me to talk to you. It doesn't help you to talk to him. It doesn't help you to talk to her over there. And that's the most important conversation that needs to happen. Not whether Paris Hilton is going to get a new dog today, or whether I don't know, Jennifer and Brad Pitt are going to break up again. That's not the most important thing. I need to know about you, and you need to know about the rest of us.
I guess, indeed, there's a socialization effect, and to touch on a point that he's making, I almost want to say there's less a socialization effect than there is an atomization effect that is rampant in our media culture right now. The kinds of things our media gets you to do are not get together with those in your community and discuss issues in a meaningful way. The things our media does not do is encourage you to get together with fellow citizens in your neighborhood, or citizens, non-citizens, everybody in your neighborhood, to get together to talk about an issue that affects you. The type of media we're getting these days is anything but that. Instead, it's much more geared toward ensuring you're going to sit there and watch. You're going to sit there and watch, and they're going to figure out the most sophisticated ways of ensuring that as you sit there and watch, you're not going to leave when the ad comes up to go to the bathroom and perhaps talk to someone else. The media is training you. It's not socializing you in the sense that I wish it would socialize you. Rather, it's with this whole push, and with interactive television and with new technologies, they're finding new and better ways to personalize messages to you, personalize news, to personalize exactly the kind of advertising. I know Comcast right now, if you have digital cable, they're rolling out, you're seeing a different ad than your neighbor is based on your demographic. In fact, certain programming that Comcast produces changes depending on your demographic. These are all things that are designed to keep you watching, not socializing.
The technology question comes to play. What are we going to see 5, 10, 20 years from now in terms of new media technology that's essentially going to tighten the conglomerate stronghold on viewers and on consumers? Can you give us some insight on new technology, what's happening?
Well, one of the things that I think is interesting is just the new HDTV standards that are coming out, and which is going to allow any station to become a superstation in and of itself. I think they're calling them. But let's just say it's WCVB in Boston area. Now they're going to be able to have another 2 or 3 digital broadcasts that are going to be coming out on the same channel. And again, I present that to ask the question. You know, if WCVB or any other TV station is going to now have 2 or 3 other channels and frequencies to send out information on, do you think it's going to be anything even more so in our favor as human beings or as citizens? You know, are they going to say, well, you know, this our main channel is commercial enough. You know, darn it, let's now have, you know, the great things that young people do channel. You know, or this is what's beautiful about being a woman. You know, or this is how powerful, you know, you can be as a human being here in the United States, or you know, or this is what's important about being human in the station. You know, is that going to happen? Or this is the station now this is the channel that's going to show us all the different candidates that are coming up in the next election, and it's going to talk in depth about their lives and what they're really here for and what we can do to be involved in that process. Do you think that's what's going to happen? I ask you.
I guess my response to my response to this question, my crystal ball is quite cloudy in this regard, because a lot of what things will look like in 20, 25 years depend a lot on what you do in the next 2. And it sounds really, really cheesy to say that, but the fact of the matter is we're at that critical juncture right now where it's very, very true. What is going on right now? We mentioned these 5 media giants before that are kind of the big content providers. 90% of what you see if you own cable comes from one of those 5, right? Now, what we're seeing increasingly is, where do people actually get these channels from? Where do people get access to the internet? Now, over-the-air TV, while once everything switches over to digital for good, indeed, it's going to be over-the-air. However, 70% of Americans these days, and the number is rising, get their media from cable. Now, both cable companies know this now, Verizon, telecommunications companies, both cable and the telecommunications giants are trying to all compete to provide what's called the triple play. That being, you can do everything over their wire. You can connect to the internet. You can get basically TV, video programming. You can also talk on the telephone. They're all racing to try and provide all those services. Now, in fact, a court case that's going to be heard later on this week, or next week rather, it's called Brand X. This is going to determine really what your media is going to look like in 20 years. This one court case, what it essentially comes down to is, over a telephone these days, It's called common carrier legislation. If you talk to someone else on a telephone, the telephone company at no point in the middle of your conversation is going to monkey with what you're saying, right? So if I'm talking to you, whatever I say goes in this end, comes out the other, unadulterated. There's nothing Verizon will do to that, and it's by law they can't do anything to that. By the same token, I can dial into the internet using my phone line, using Earthlink, using Net Zero, using any number of providers besides Verizon. Why? Because Verizon has to carry anybody for a reasonable rate, but they have to carry anybody without monkeying with what they're doing. That's what governs phones. Now, cable is another matter. Comcast, for the longest time, they weren't, it was just cable, but now they can provide internet service. It's a two-way thing. Right now, this common carrier regulation is supposed to cover, if someone's able to talk to another and back and forth, it basically says you can't monkey with what's happening in the middle. So folks like Net Zero, folks like Earthlink are saying, hey, Comcast, you're a telecommunications provider now. You're doing two-way. We want in. We want to provide service instead of just you. We want to do this. And so everybody went to court. The outcome of this is going to determine a hell of a lot of things. If the court goes Comcast's way, if cable ends up not having to be common carrier, it doesn't have to carry everything, this ties over into content. We're talking about now, if Comcast wins this one, if big cable wins this particular Supreme Court battle, the internet of tomorrow is going to look like, all right, I want to look at Disney. Well, that's great. Comcast has a business deal with Disney, and you're more than welcome to look at Disney's content if you have a Comcast internet connection. I'd like to look at the Indie Media Center now. When Comcast comes back and says, we do not have a business deal with the Internet Media Center, so you're more than welcome to access it for an additional fee of $70, if they allow you to access it at all. Or perhaps they will allow you to access it, but they'll make sure it loads so damn slow you'll never want to look at it again after you try. So essentially, the very future of our open internet is very much at stake next week. This is something too where if it goes the wrong way, your actions in Congress, if you scream to Congress and say what the Supreme Court just did is kind of messed up, we need to find an end run around this to make sure that open access lives on the internet. Depending on what you do, we might very well have an internet that lasts, in the sense that we have it. Otherwise, it could very well be a two-wire world. You'll either get access to media, period, because everything, of course, is coming down that wire, right? TV, internet, phone, everything's coming down one of two wires, the cable companies or the phone companies. And they're going to have ultimate sway over what you can access. Because I assure you, if the cable companies win the Supreme Court, Verizon's going to sit back and say, hey, we want that too. We want to control. And the current FCC's done everything they can to actually push this very kind of thing along, even while they're saying this is for competition's sake. It all depends on what you do in the next year.
And I think a really important issue is being made around distribution. I think at this time, with the kinds of digital technology that we have, a lot of us, any of us, can go out and produce good content. Okay, we can do that. We're smart enough. We're good enough. We know what we're talking about. If we're educated enough with content, we can do this. We can create the TV shows. We can create the radio shows. But can we get them distributed? Okay, and I think that's one of the toughest things that's out there. And I think you're talking about how the machinations of the industry are making it really hard for us to get our information to us. Okay, so that's something that really needs to be looked at, and I think we really need to look at some of these trends really closely, and if we're going to be involved in that process, or if we're just going to let that wave wash over us.
Excellent. We have our third panelist here today, better late than never. From Media Tank, Earl Dack. Earl, thank you for coming. Earl, we'll start with you, put you right on the spot. Can you discuss the state of modern American journalism and its positive or negative effects on democracy?
The state of modern American journalism.
Where journalism is today in this country in terms of mass media and journalism.
Okay, well, apologies for being late. I'm coming in from Philadelphia, and I guess I don't know, did you do... Media Tank is a grassroots organization in Philadelphia. We work to educate people, mobilize people at the grassroots level around issues of media reform and education. And just to clarify, my background is more so in the organizing area, specifically around student organizing at the University of Pennsylvania, and also as a board member for Media Tank. So I'll take a stab at these larger questions. I certainly am familiar with them, but I'm not an expert by any means.
You mess with your mic while you're talking.
Okay, so, well, the state of journalism. I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to give you all kinds of statistics and facts, but clearly, if you watch the evening news, even if you watch cable news, 24-hour news network. I actually got rid of cable because I was so appalled. It was like watching a train wreck. To watch even CNN, much less Fox, but. It's like this constant stream of really sensational news items, and it's just amazing to me that you have a 24-hour channel and you still can't really get context for things, They're talking about, Iraq or any sort of international news, and so rarely you actually get any sort of lengthy coverage that tries to place what's happening today in context, and I think that that's, certainly true of the network news, but even on a 24-hour news channel, and how can you, in terms of democracy, how can you make informed decisions about the functioning of your country, about our role in international affairs, when, the news is largely ahistorical, and it certainly has to do with the for-profit nature of the media system. If the bottom line is really your profit margin, then, where's the incentive? You want the thing that's slick and sells and, is going to grab eyeballs. And so we have, the Michael Jackson case and all of these sorts of sensational things that, presumably people want to see. But I don't even know if that's true. We say we're in a free market and the free market economy, but I don't know. I think that actually it's more of a case that it's like what's cheap and easy and it doesn't really require a lot of these large media companies. So I think there is an audience. It's great to see the independent media movement sort of grow and flourish, and there are people out there who are hungry for information, for context, for a more probing analysis. But again, situations like this with the common carrier, stake in broadband and things like that, when you don't have the millions of dollars to advertise and to sort of push your product down the throats of the the viewing populace, it does make it a challenge. I think that it's given the fact that the independent media movement has taken off with so little so few resources, it's really a testament to the fact that there is an audience out there.
A question.
I have a question for you. Talking about modern journalism, I was just wondering, what do you all think? How Fox is considered the Republican network? Do you all think that will get worse in the next 20 years? Do you think the public will catch on to that more so than they are today? I know that I live in Texas in the South, and the fury of where everyone loves Fox, and I didn't know a thing about it until I got to school. So I feel like maybe a lot of people are dumbfounded. What do you all think about that issue?
Well, there is a video that talks about, that's out, and I think it's by the Media Education Foundation, that talks about the myth of the liberal media. And I think one of the things that it's saying, and excuse me for whoever produced that if I'm quoting it wrong. But, okay, cool. But I think I think that there's going to be that tendency for the media and for the news to be more conservative. But I caution myself at least to be careful about whether I call it Republican or Democrat, because the qualities of what we know to be Republican and Democrat have shifted over the years too. What that means, is kind of fluid and serves the purposes of whoever's in there. I still think that we have to work really hard to make the Republican and Democratic parties really democratic parties in and of their own right. Because, as much as we talk about Republicans and Democrats, I can't say that, I can't look in my address book and say, oh yeah, that's a Democrat, that's a Republican, that's a Democrat. I hadn't met any, that kind of thing. So it's like, why are we talking about Republicans and Democrats if at least for me, I'm just talking about my experience, that they're not in my life. Maybe that's just, maybe everybody else knows Republicans and Democrats, that's fine, but But I think definitely the media is going to go further that way, and I think it's going to tip at a certain point. It can't go that way forever. I mean, we can look at any political system, any structure, and we can try to build it up as much as we can. And this is all under pressure. Capitalism is a really weird animal. It tries really hard to make sure that it pulls together all its resources, and it works really hard at that. It's part of the process is oppressing people. Part of it is keeping people, unaware of certain things, and that can't happen forever. We're too smart for that, and we don't even know it. That we're too smart for that, and just our process of being human is bringing down that process. So yes, I think it's going to go in that direction, but I think that it can't last forever. And just like you're saying, with some of the things that's happening around in the media, those are some of the things that are going to turn that around. So that in a sense we won't be able to point at media someday. And this is the image that I have of it, and I think it's real. That it's going to be a function that's going to be held by us. That we're going to have control of a lot of that over time, but it's not going to happen tomorrow, it's not going to happen the next day, but it's going to happen with a lot of work from us.
I guess I have a slightly different take on the whole bias thing. I mean, if you go back to when perhaps one could argue was the most vibrant period in American particular media, was essentially back in the days before objectivity took hold. Quite honestly, you had a time period where you had pamphlets coming from all directions, except the difference then was that you had a ton of independent media being subsidized, either postal subsidies by the United States government at the time, and plus you knew where the viewpoint was coming from. Like one could argue you have the most robust political discourse when this particular paper comes from a point of view, this particular one comes from a point of view, this one comes from a different point of view. Yeah, it's a fantastic thing. Now, the problem with Fox and the problem with stations that end up having a conservative bent is that these days it's less about we are a conservative news network or lean conservative. It's that it leans conservative while claiming to be objective. Therein lies the problem. But really, if you look at the roots of objectivity in general, the whole reason the notion exists is not because of any higher journalistic goal. There was no one that ever sat back and said, you know what, it would be really great. The problem with our media is that we're too damn biased. And if we just had a reporter who was out there covering both sides of the issue, then maybe we'd be better informed. The issue was, you have something in the 1800s like the Associated Press wires coming into existence. They want to sell news stories to as broad a spectrum of newspapers as they wanted to. If you came out and were coming out from a flaming left or flaming right, half the papers would buy, half the papers wouldn't. If you suddenly came out and said, "Oh, we're objective, we offer safe stories here," then virtually everyone would buy. It was an economic decision rather than a decision made because they figured journalism would become better. When one looks at the basis of objectivity, it's a lot less about journalistic integrity than it is about economics. And the fact that objectivity has become sort of the norm, and when people talk about journalism in terms of, this journalism is really awful because it comes from one point of view, I'd argue that a press that was completely and utterly and ravingly partisan, as long as you knew where the point of view was coming from in those papers, we'd likely have a much more robust political discourse in this country.
Excellent, thank you. We've spent the first hour now talking about the issues in the prompt. Do we have another question?
Yes,
yeah, okay, let's start with questions. What the heck?
Okay, I'll make it fast. Quick comment and a question. Given, in the light of everything that the panelists talked about, the history, the FCC rules and so on and so forth, do you, any of you, all of you, have any proposal as to how to solve? I'm talking about news media, by the way. And before you answer that, I would like to bring your attention to the news that came out today. I just kind of read it or heard it rather passing on NPR about the new genre called video news reel, I think they're calling it, VNR, which was 2 years ago. It was released by the government, made by the army. And it took our media 2 years to figure that out. In other words, it was nothing but propaganda regarding the fall of Baghdad. I mean, that's a litmus test right there. Given that, my question now is, what do you propose? And before you answer that, one last comment. How about rating the news itself? Rating movies. How about creating the news. There's got to be some neutrality. What do you guys think of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, that's definitely an issue. Video news releases. I mean, so much of what passes for news now is, comes from PR firms. It's, a lot of spin. There's really a lot of great documentaries, Media Education Foundation and other organizations that deal with these sorts of issues. John Stauber's PR Watch. And in terms of rating the news, I think that's an idea. I think one of the most successful models that I'm aware of is, organizations that have gone ahead and done monitoring projects. There's a group in the Bay Area called Youth Media Council, and they actually worked with minority youth in the community to monitor one of the radio stations. It was sort of a hip-hop radio station that had been very community-oriented and had a lot of community voices on the radio. It was a great place for stories from the point of view of community members and hip-hop listeners to be aired and get a sort of, to be disseminated through the community there in the Bay Area. And then it was acquired by Clear Channel, and there was a dramatic shift in content and programs that were dealing with political issues and more radical or perspectives were cut. People were fired, and they actually did a monitoring project with the youth where they listened and kind of noted tried to quantify what the content of the channel was in light of this transition, and then they issued a report and they made demands and they had accountability sessions with the management at the Clear Channel station there, and it was very successful. So, I think that it's along the lines. I don't know about a rating system per se, but I think that monitoring projects can be really effective and have proven to have some impact.
I guess in answer to that, I have kind of a 5-step program to fixing that. One of it's practical, 4 of it's political. All right. Practical, produce, and just get in the habit of being producers rather than watchers. That's something that is absolutely key. Now, going to the political realm, there's a ton you can do, and it centers around 4 things. Number 1, you've got to rally around policies that support as diverse and ownership of media as possible. Wherever you see consolidation, you have to fight it. Because the number 1 way to make sure that you have the most diverse viewpoints out there is to make sure there's the most diverse number of owners of media out there. Number 2, you have to get behind policies that make media accountable to the public at the local, state, and national levels, just like Earl was just talking about. You not only have to confront media where it is in your backyard, you also have to confront it in Congress. We're talking a situation right now where if a station is blatantly not serving the public interest, if it's coming out and maligning a community, it is virtually impossible for you to have its license revoked. Stations have their licenses renewed every 8 years. At that period, you can put in informal objections, and the FCC will say, there's obviously complaints here. Check off. Okay, maybe it'll be better next time. You can file a formal petition, which costs a lot of money and a lot of lawyers and a lot of time, and you'll still lose. The standard of proof you have is so high. We have to get that standard back down. Step 4, you have to fight for policies that give communities access to their own media and their own airwaves. I mean, the airwaves are yours, they're public, but you live in a time where, thanks to policy, not because of market forces or anything natural, Clear Channel is allowed to own 8 radio stations, and you sitting in a room here that actually have local concerns and aren't computer banking shows and having a bunch of computers off someplace programming those 8 stations, you're not allowed to have 1. That's got to change. And finally, the most important thing as you do this is to get more people involved in media policy making to support these kinds of things. That's my 5-point plan to fix our media.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on one of those things. And when you said produce, I think that's really important. I think one of the most powerful things we can do is start to tell our own stories and to learn the techniques. And I think that's one of the things you do here at Emerson, right? Am I right? Yeah. Okay, are you happy about that? Okay, do you understand how powerful that is? Do you understand how powerful that is? Okay, well, hopefully we're going to have to tell you tonight then if you don't understand how powerful it is. It truly is. And for you to produce your own stories about what's happening in your own communities, like there was one thing that Project Think Different did was to help a group of young people through the citizen schools produce a PSA about what they thought about what they thought about the news. And I think it wasn't so important that they got their 30-second PSA on WHDH, and I think that was great. That was beautiful. But the thing that happened was that they were able to think about the process of what was going on for, what was happening to their, to their own image of themselves by what was being communicated through the news. That process of really thinking about that and then producing something that told the community, hey, something, we're not happy about this and we want that to change. I think there needs to be 100 million more of those kinds of things happening. We do need to set up our own news services, that kind of thing. Again, how come we're not communicating to ourselves about these things?
So many questions. Let's start a line.
So
let's go here first. Can you guys start a line? We can get a line. Sure, come up with follow-up, but let's start with here first. We'll try to spread it.
And if I may say really quickly, I'm really glad we're now talking to each other, because I was starting to think that I was in a TV, for a little bit. Yeah, it's all coming this way. And I was a little uncomfortable with that, so thank you.
My question has to do with what we started to touch upon as students entering different facets of the media, kind of the social responsibility that we will face and issues with censorship. I kind of thought maybe you could talk a little bit about what we may face entering whatever field it may be, film, radio, advertising, journalism, and some of the obstacles that any advice.
Well, I have a question about what do you think about the censorship? What do you mean about that censorship?
We kind of touched upon it with Clear Channel and political issues and how societal it can be with these major corporations and how much you can voice or what you can actually air different images. And I don't really know much about that because I receive, I haven't been out there to put out some subscribers yet. So
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think one of the really important things that we can do if we're and I think about TV a lot, and because it's kind of the thing I talk about a lot. So I'll speak to that, and I think it's the same in a lot of different areas. One of the things you can do is be the best communicator, be the best editor, be the best camera person, be the best producer, be the best director you can possibly be. With that professional collateral, you can say, something. I think if we show this image, that's going to skew it a certain way, and because if we're going to show women in this light, I think that's going to alienate some of our viewership. You have to campaign within the editing room, for those kinds of things, or within the production meetings for the things that to be right. Also, yes, from the outside, after we see these images, like you're talking about happening out in the Bay Area, we need to talk to the stations or talk to the companies like I think it was Prima Industries or something like that put out Panty Raider, a video game. And there was all kinds of stuff about Panty Raider and how crazy that was. But when I went to get information about it, no one would take responsibility for who created Panty Raider. And do a little research. It's probably the most horrible video game ever. So I always point people toward horrible things, but because you need to know what's being said out there. But I think there's ways that we definitely have to be the best that we can be, but use that collateral, use that professionalism to say, look, I don't think it's going to work, and tell them why. Learn to be media literate and say, and come at it from the people's point of view. Say, this is going to hurt people. If we put out a show like The Swan, how come we have to focus so much on the plastic surgery? How come we can't talk about the therapy? Or how come we can't talk about the issues of how do they build family? How do they build support in their own neighborhoods? To help them understand their perception of themselves. Those kinds of things. Those are suggestions that need to come out in that area.
I guess I was getting at is a mass level. Because I feel like by sheltering us,
right,
as consumers, it's a lot safer. But by not making us politically aware of what's going on in the world around us, I feel like no matter what, it almost seems like it's a lost cause to get some of those images and messages out there on a kind of major mass level through Fox, through some of these major corporations. Why would they want us to know these things? It's so much easier to control when you don't know.
they don't want you
Yes.
to know those things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that you have to really make a decision for yourself, like how much are you willing to compromise, you know? And I think that you have to recognize that the more comfortable you want to be, the more affluent you want to be, the more sort of quote unquote success in, sort of the more socially conventional ways, upwardly mobile, all those sorts of things, writing for the New York Times or whatever the markers of success are.
Those ways, because that's the easiest way to reach the masses. I mean, they have
Well,
audiences.
It is, but I still think, and maybe I'm just cynical, maybe I'm unrealistic, I don't know, but I think that, there's just, when you're in a really large media corporation where the bottom line is profit, I mean, even we were talking about objectivity, it's like, I mean, every major paper has a business section. I think it was maybe Noam Chomsky that talks about this, almost none has a labor section. Is that objective? Are there not millions of Americans who are laboring classes that would be interested in labor issues? Why isn't that a perspective that is in, the newspaper of record? And I think, you have to recognize that there is this point of view that's operational, and it's going to influence what you have the capacity to do. And sure, you have the ability to reach more people, but you're going to be paying your dues for a long time before you reach a point where you have the ability to really influence content in a serious way. I mean, I would say if you're really committed to that kind of journalism, personally, I would go intern with Democracy Now!, or I would do something with Harper's Magazine, or find an outlet that has a perspective and a point of view that you agree with, or start your own independent magazine or zine or whatever. I mean, I don't know, but I just think, we need good people, we need progressive people in the corporate media as well, but I think you just have to be honest with yourself and recognize that it's going to be you'll face a lot of challenges.
Clearly, and I tell my students that all the time, because it's really a mill. Some of my colleagues are people who can't wait to get out of the industry. They're just dying to raise horses or something, anything, to grow some, kumquats or something like that. Finally, something that's real, instead of, hawking cars or something like that, on TV. So I agree wholeheartedly. I think, it's much better to find people who are of like mind and have the skills, because just because Viacom is big doesn't mean they're doing it best. I think we have many better ideas. We just don't know it again, because we're not talking to each other on the levels that we need to, and we're beginning to, with the Boston Independent Media Center. We need to be involved in that. We need to be involved in Project Think Different and Free Press and Media Tank, and start to talk about what ways can we get this information out to the people better than Viacom does it. They're not the geniuses of this. They just got there first, and they're just bigger right now. They don't have to stay that way, but that's up to us.
Indeed, just to add one last thing. I mean, we're very trained. We're very trained to believe exactly what you just said, that Viacom is. The reason they're biggest is because they are the best at it. It's about not only starting up new outlets like the Independent Media Center, but to believe that getting enough folks together to do that kind of thing is going to make the difference. And that in addition to producing and starting those things up, you're going to have to fight to provide space in the media universe for that. And you actually do have the opportunity in the political realm, possibly for about 3 or 4 years, I'd say, is the window to really claim some space for more public interest media, as we're talking about here.
Can I just add real quick to that? I mean, I think the example of Democracy Now! Is really interesting, because when I first encountered it, and are most people familiar with Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman?
Does it still exist?
It does, and it's continued to grow. But when I first encountered it, my impression and what I encountered in any kind of writing about it or people talking about it was, that left-wing program, that Amy Goodman, she's a raving liberal, And it's, steadily gained a following, and, to the point where you actually have networks or the AP who will be looking to Democracy Now! When what was it, Aristide and Amy Goodman was with him when he came back from Africa. I mean, there were major networks and major corporate news outlets that were going to Democracy Now! To get the on-the-ground information, and I think it's what she calls like grassroots up journalism or something like that. But I think it's a really powerful example of the impact that you can have if you really just do the work and do it well, and believe that you can find an audience and that people are out there who want to hear your perspective on this.
And there's a great article about Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! In Yes Magazine, the current issue of Yes Magazine, that is covering a lot about media too. So that might be a good place to look.
Hey. I don't know where to start. Well, we're here because we're talking about this mass media, the mainstream, the machine, and then you guys and us are coming up with these solutions as something better. And I don't want to sound like I'm being pessimistic here, but ever since I was 18, I'm thinking the only way to fight the machine is to have an alternative discourse. But what's happening when the alternative discourse is becoming mainstream part deux? You have like this discourse dichotomy, and the only way you go is here or there. And what pisses me off is that we're I'm sorry.
That's great.
Emotions. What pisses me off is that we're spending so much time, we're trying to work as individuals to come up with something great, to let us know that our individual selves are better than Viacom and whatnot. And I don't want to sound like I'm being mean, but where I'm from, it's not working. It's making matters worse. I'm from Quebec, and I'm sure someone else will agree with me, but you were either part of this average mainstream thing, or you were either a separatist fighting against the machine. And what that has turned into is that it hadn't made matters better. It's making matters worse. You've got good, intelligent programming being sponsored by milk and toys. This is supposed to be the intellectual crop of where I'm from, Canada, and it's not anymore. It's drowning and it's becoming awful. And I love IKEA, I love Old Navy, but you got the Swan, and you got someone else telling us that being fat is beautiful. But when I go to Old Navy and I see size 2 next to a size 20, I'm being told that being fat is okay, and that going to McDonald's is an excuse, and buying 7 pairs of shoes like Carrie Bradshaw is okay. And it's not. And we're just, what are we going to do? I know we're coming with a solution, but it's not going anywhere. So I'm feeling like I'm spending my very not so hard earned American money tuition there, something not so good.
Yeah.
I'm mad.
Good. Thank you for being human about your feelings about this. I really appreciate that.
I'm fat and I'm mad because that size 20 is coming right towards me, and I'm thinking this isn't okay. And IKEA, I love IKEA, and I feel every time I go there and I buy those stupid little rice lamps, the friendliness of it is sickening. I mean, I just buy those paper lamps and I get shell shocked. It's just.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, and this may sound kind of goofy and stupid, but one of the things we need to do is be able to believe. We have to have faith in the process of positive work and progressive work. We have to be able to see through the mishmash of what looks like it's not working, and look at some of these organizations and say, yeah, okay, it may not be completely rooted yet, but it's worth the process. The principles are worth the process, and that it's worth doing the work. Another thing that we need to build is patience. We need to be able to sit there. And one of the reasons why I would rather see, kids go out and spend 4 hours watching a kumquat grow. They'd learn more doing that than watching TV these days. Because they would understand so much about the world, that things take time, and that things of value come through work and through nurturing them. And I think that's one of the things we have to get used to doing, is nurturing the things that are best for us, and be patient about that process. Not stop our anger, and not just shut it all down. That's again why I'm really glad you're angry, because I get pissed too. And I go into my classes that way, and I'm glad you're angry too. I hate it when my students aren't angry about the things that are on there, and it just makes me angrier. So thank you so much, but I think it's really important to look at those issues.
But I think that also what makes me feel mad is I feel like I should be, because I'm against it, I should be purging myself of this lovely, bubbly entertainment. I love TV. I love watching sitcoms, and yes, I own Friends DVDs, and I'm not ashamed to say it. But when does critical thinking become hating the machine? And, it's just, I'm trying to think that, my boyfriend works for Hasbro, so we have like both opposite ends of the spectrums in our house, and he's a marketing manager. And I'm thinking, I want to go in the music industry and the film industry, and I want to make something fun and interesting that people will want to watch. But I don't want it to be ruined. Right. And I'm thinking, is that possible? Will that ever be possible? Thinking no, but anyway.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi. I'm a broadcast journalism major, so I suppose that's the perspective that this question is drawn upon. It seems that one of the major problems, especially in news gathering medias, is that it's the narrowing of the discourse. I was wondering, is that a purely American problem? Is there alternatives that we can look to across the ocean? I know you mentioned Canada and the BBC, but more in a historical sense. I was wondering, are there any lessons to be learned elsewhere?
Can you repeat the first part of the question again? I'm sorry.
The first part of the question would have been, are there any examples in maybe comparable news markets across the world that maybe aren't narrowing the discourse so much, aren't so hyper-commercialized, aren't so prepackaged? Like you said, the 24-hour news networks, pretty much, even though they're 24-hour, there's no context there. They're all the same stories over and over again because it's safe. I was wondering, is that the same thing all across the world?
I'd almost say that the similar pressures. I mean, we're ceasing to look at media and the media industry as just existing within the United States and within Canada and within Britain. I mean, virtually every broadcasting system across the globe right now is experiencing exactly the same kind of pressures that we are. I mean, I think there are definitely lessons to be learned from the BBC and how the Canadian Broadcasting Service all got started, but those forces also are under heavy-duty attack right now. There's what a lesson I would take away is to try and see how these two forces are being chipped away at by commercial interests, and they're largely interests stemming from our own country here. Now, there's also lessons to be learned. Believe it or not, there's fantastic resources within the United States to learn from. I know that our colleagues at the Prometheus Radio Project in Philadelphia go around the country and around the world helping construct low-power radio stations. And some of these community radio stations have the most vibrant programming, the most vital programming locally. There's a lot to be learned from them. So I suppose if you want to, as far as lessons I would like to learn, I want to observe how those stations operate because they truly are bottom up. Well, bottom up, I'll put that in quotes. It's really unfair. Grass tops, really. And I would pay attention to looking at countries that have national systems, countries that started up public systems based around public interest values, and watch and take heed as you see those things being chipped away. The BBC and the Canadian Broadcasting Services these days, just like our own, we're carrying a lot more underwriting, largely because they're getting a little less support from the places they used to gain support. It's the same argument why these days you have full-length almost ads on the American Public Broadcasting Service. It's largely because they're dependent on what Congress is going to give them. And when Congress isn't happy, they give less. And then you're forced to go for more advertising in the form of underwriting, and all the commercial broadcasters sit back and say, why are we subsidizing something that's advertising? It's comparison of systems, I suppose, is where I'm going. I went somewhere very different than where your question started there. I'm realizing so.
I would just add, I mean, that's true, and I think one of the reasons that it's really important to get involved in the movements for media reform and education, media justice here in the States is that, you know, these multinational media conglomerates do have a tremendous influence on media systems in other countries, you know, and so your activism here is also helping to preserve a more democratic media in other countries. But I do think that there are, I mean, even when I was in Berlin last year, and it's more along those lines of where you have, you know, there's, you know, several newspapers, and this is the more conservative paper, and this is the liberal paper, and I certainly think there are differences and a more diverse multiplicity of perspectives in other media systems. And also, I mean, even just if you look at CNN, it's an often trotted out situation in terms of the disparity between CNN that we get here and CNN International, even something as simple as whether or not they're showing the bodies of victims in the Iraq War. You know, if you're, I mean, and that's another Amy Goodman story, but she talks about, you know, being in Europe and going around and talking to people, and everywhere people are seeing these images and they're horrified, and, you know, you just don't see them here. And it's the same company, CNN, but they know what is acceptable to show here and what is not, you know. So it's this sort of, you know, it's not, there's a tacit complicity, you know, in terms of what, you know, it's acceptable to let the American people know, and that isn't as true in other countries.
And again, I'd point you to Yes Magazine, because I think they talked about Prometheus in that recent issue, and they also talked about how I think Coca-Cola gained, you know, a foothold in Russian, you know, Russian advertising, and I think all of that, you know, just is a really good mix for kind of, you know, talking about what you're interested in. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Before I ask a question, I just wanted to offer really sincere gratitude and appreciation for the people who organized this event, especially the students, as I understand both grad students and undergrads who came together to make this happen in a city, Boston, where I'm not sure there's ever been a forum quite like this. And I hope this is the beginning of many, many more very public and wide open forums in addressing all these issues, because there's obviously tremendous interest among students, and it's so important for this to grow out of students, and so great that it's growing out of Emerson College of Communications. I say that partly as a media worker myself, as a volunteer, and I've found it tremendously meaningful work. And for anyone in the room who cares about these issues and feels a passion about them, I just want to let people know, because when I started my work, I had no idea about the range of opportunities. They just either they didn't exist or I didn't know anything about them, because they're not advertised on Comcast or on other cable channels. But right here in Boston, there's a whole range of ways to be involved in community access media, ranging from your local community access television stations to some level of community access at campus community radio stations, including Emerson, Boston College, MIT, Tufts, a number of them that do allow some access, as well as the Boston Independent Media Center that Ukumwa mentioned, and there are flyers about a lot of those organizations out on the table. And incidentally, Democracy Now! Is heard now on one of these stations because of the efforts specifically of volunteers who worked to get it on the air here. It's on daily at noon on 90.3 FM. But anyway, I didn't come up here other than to just let you know there's a whole range of stuff to explore, and to ask this really specific question. I'm curious, you kind of laid out, Russ, how things have emerged in the last 70 years, and the reason we're in this position right now in this room with these problems, and we are like fleas batting up against a brick wall of Comcast and the lobbyists you mentioned who met all in those rooms in 70 meetings with the FCC, and there were, 5 meetings like this, or members of the public? The reason we're here is that 70 years of history, all that started from the Telecommunications Act in 1934. We face in the next few years an opportunity to make some little impact changes now that will have impact for the rest of the century. And I just wonder what you all feel are some of the most important things to focus in on in the next few years. I wonder if changing something about digital radio allocations is among them. I don't know. I can't compare that to the whole range of things you guys are probably more familiar with. But especially considering that groups like Prometheus are involved in grabbing for low power stations. Those are the crumbs. That's all that's left of the broadcast spectrum. We need to get them now, and they do wonderful work, and I support them. But how can we reach for the bigger access to a lot more for the future? Thanks.
Thank you.
I guess really the things you really want to be looking for right now, guaranteed, as these debates go forward, and they're already starting. I mean, the folks who are going to be working on the Telecom Act are already meeting behind closed doors with Microsoft in coming weeks, with SBC, the telecommunications companies, and I guarantee you, as they meet with these folks, the telecommunications and cable companies are not going to tell them, you really should talk to this awesome group based at Emerson, because they might have some other opinions than we do about how these things should develop. Things you need to be demanding. As we move into the digital world from analog, you need to be demanding space for public interest media. You need to be demanding, first of all, space. You need to be demanding funding. When Comcast comes into your town and tears up your streets and lines your telephone poles with wire, they owe you. They're using public rights of way. They're making beaucoup dollars from you. They owe you. Right now, in many towns across the United States, we do have a way to maintain some semblance of democratic control over those providers. Are called franchise agreements. And quickly, under our noses right now, plenty of legislation's popping up. It's trying to get rid of those. So you want space, and you want some sort of control over that conduit that's coming through your town to make sure that if they start impinging on your space, you have something to do about it. And then third, you want to make sure that you're pushing for policies that see the value in independent, non-commercial media and will subsidize that. This is not such a foreign concept in the United States. It did exist. In that time when I talked about where there was a fiercely partisan media, there were postal subsidies and subsidies for small papers to encourage their growth. In fact, the founders saw it as vital that this growth be encouraged with some sort of subsidy, and so we need to get that back, because the biggest players in our media right now made their fortunes based on these very subsidies that they're now saying never happened. They're just the best. They won. The market wins. You win when the market wins. Blah, blah, blah. So it's space, control, and funding. Those three things in all forms of media, be it via the airwaves, be it via the wires that come into your house. If you push for those things, you're going to be on your way toward a happier 21st century media future. Yeah.
And one thing I would add to that is create better content. Mm-hmm. Okay? I know we can do that. That's one of the things that we support and one of the things we do in Project Think Different. Develop better shows. Develop better video games. Develop better radio shows. Do it differently. Do it better. Again, just because they're doing it now doesn't mean they're doing it best. And I know we can do it better. I know that. All right.
I would just add a plug for media education and media literacy. I think that, well, it's arguable whether or not we're teaching critical thinking skills at all in our public education system or in many schools in our public education system.
Isn't Chris Whittle there to help us do that? Huh? Chris Whittle in Channel 1.
Yeah, right. But, I think that, at least for myself and the young woman who was talking about bubbly entertainment and liking Friends, I think, a lot of people who end up in roles as educators doing media literacy work. I've done a fair amount, and I watched tons of television as a kid. I loved television. I'm much more selective, and I don't watch as much today. But I think you can appreciate it, you can enjoy it, and if you really have been, that's kind of the exciting thing. So many of us living in this country have watched countless hours of television. We're experts at all elements of television production, and when you just give the basic tools for kind of deconstructing the media to kids, really even young kids, they really can just start breaking things down. But it's that readjustment, that reorientation, instead of just being immersed in this hyper-mediated environment and kind of taking it all in without ever stepping back to look critically at it, just making that slight adjustment, and then suddenly you can't stop. And I think that there's a real sort of revolutionary potential in that. If everyone that is a media consumer was really thinking critically about the media and asking the kinds of questions that you're asking here, it would make it much easier to grow the movements for media education and reform.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have two questions, but I want to preface my questions with some remarks so you'll understand where I'm coming from. I feel I appreciate everything that everyone said, and my questions stem from the fact that I feel that we're living in a banana republic or 2 doors down from fascism, however you want to whatever context you want to put on it. And I've come to realize that I have to have a day job in order to do real work. And the other thing is that many people that I know who are so-called progressives or on the left or my age, been around the block, don't really understand the extent to which the media has been, how stupid we all are now. And the comment that you made about CNN packaging its programs different in Europe is an example, or relates to my first question, which is, I feel that because we are at that point, while all of these things are important, and especially working hard in these next few years, a national boycott of corporate media is necessary to scare the shit out of them, pardon me, because that's what's going to make some kind of dent in this, because we watched 2 elections being stolen. So we've got to act with money and some kind of organization, and I'm willing to go along with whatever the Democracy Now!, Move On, many of those groups come up with. So I just want to sort of pose that as a question or a way to go with that. The second part of my question, and I'm not a tech person at all, has to do with, and I'm going to back up, this is where I should have given you some background. When I was in China 2 years ago, the only time the tour guides or the people I was with would speak was when we were alone, answer any real questions. And I understood this was left over, and I understood the reasons they did that. I witnessed a press conference in Beijing that made me think that even CNN or Fox on the worst day is better. And that's saying a lot. That's how bad it was. And also, if you switch on, I was telling someone online, if you switch on the cable international TV, even though from China you're not going to get any discussion, you are going to get shots of Iraq, shots of dead bodies, all kinds of things. Bush, getting his mic set up as opposed to when he's ready for the camera. So that's available, aside from what you said about different countries having their political parties identified. Here's my question. It's 2-tiered. What are we going to do if they shut us down? And this relates to China. My mother said, well, you're just going to have to meet. They're going to make it illegal for 4 people to meet on the street. You're going to have to get together and come up with some other method of communication. And having said that, I also wonder about people who are really sophisticated in terms of technology. I mean, those are the people who made Viacom big. The shrewd managers are not the geniuses. It's the people who invent stuff. And are there ways to circumvent or broadcast or reach each other or transmit? I mean, that's my other question. And I'll take those responses sitting down because I've been on my feet for a while. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I think, I like the idea of boycotting the major media. But I think maybe a stronger statement is made by the Nielsen families, because that's who they're watching, as far as, who's watching them. Because they don't, if we're not a Nielsen family, they don't know we're there. They just guess we're there. The numbers kind of say, well, we can, extrapolate and say that, there's so many billions of people, watching at this time. Also, maybe we need to boycott the advertisers supporting the top-rated shows. Okay, maybe that's where the biggest chunk can be taken out, as opposed to just and yes, there's a great benefit to just not watching TV, but maybe we need to target those advertisers. You asked the question, what if they shut us down? We go back up again. If they shut us down in one way, we turn on in a different way. We have to do it outside of that realm. Whether that and that's another reason why we need to just study how societies have created, revolution, how they've created, progress, how they've created new ways of doing things. How did Ghana do it? How did Peru do it? How did they do it in France? How did they do it anywhere, in the world? And we have to remember that media is just a way to get the information through. It's mediums. That's all it is, And it's just a tool, so we just have to learn how to use that tool without somebody seeing us. And when they find out that we're over here, we got to move it to the other place. There's a great benefit that can be had from learning all this digital technology, and also learning how to use transmission techniques. Using the low power radio stations is really powerful. I mean, it's much more powerful than having one that you can't move. That kind of thing. So we have to think really creatively about every single part of it. And when somebody says you can't do that, we can say, no, to hell with you, we're going to do it anyway. Or we don't have to tell them that. We're just going to do it without them seeing. And there's a lot of ramifications to that that obviously have to be hammered out over time. But just because somebody tells us we can't doesn't mean we stop.
My apologies, I didn't make it clear. I meant to make a boycott of newspapers, which
Okay.
I feel.
Oh, cool. Great. Beautiful. Okay, beautiful. And again, that's my TV head. I'm sorry.
Well, I guess even beyond that, there's an aspect of boycotting that's attractive, and then there's the whole challenge of it. That being the folks that are providing the vast majority of what you see have their fingers in so many pots. You can try and avoid one, and you'll still get hit some other way. It's like try and avoid our newspaper. You're buying our cupcakes. It's that kind of thing. So I'm thinking in terms of what's really effective. I'm thinking back to the history of how low-power FM even came to pass. It came through massive amounts of civil disobedience where a bunch of pirate broadcasters just incessantly popped onto the air without licenses, did really good stuff, and then when they were all shut down, there was enough outrage that communities lost this new outlet. It forced the FCC to come up with a low-power FM service. Now, the broadcasters fought it every step of the way, and they ultimately won in many regards, but it's back. And there's actually a bill that's been introduced in Congress that would give communities, thousands more communities, access to a low-power FM station. So it's one thing to resist. It's another thing to just outright, this is where I get myself in trouble and take off the free press hat, break bad laws. Quite honestly, civil disobedience is what got low power where it is. We need to, like you were saying, we need to be thinking more creatively about what ways we can innovate and skirt around the laws that are holding us back with new communications technology to prove it has value, it works, and that communities need it.
Which takes time and commitment and patience.
I just wanted to add to that real quick, well, hopefully quickly, but I think that, we just have to really develop a lot more strategic thinking around these issues because, honestly, I think we have such a quality of life here in the United States that it would take quite a lot to get a majority of people to engage in some sort of boycott of, corporate media or news outlets. And, it's like, how do you inspire outrage? How do you, create the discontent amongst people who are enjoying a very comfortable, way of life in many ways, And so I think, whether it's, creative action, civil disobedience that sort of draw attention to particular ways, or however, independent media, zines, creating your own content. I mean, there's lots of different ways, but I think that, it's really important for us as a movement to really be thinking strategically because, we are living in a very different time, unlike any other time in history, really. I mean, and I don't know how many of you, I guess in the department probably are familiar with Marshall McLuhan, but he talks about, living in and this is like 50 years ago, where it's, this unprecedented age where, we've only, for however long, 100 years or whatever, had the color picture, and then even more recently the ability to have this moving color picture, and now all of these digital technologies. And what are the consequences for our society and our way of life for all of these technologies? We don't really have a very rich discussion about this. We all sort of, or many of us, embrace the cell phone, the games on the cell phone. I mean, it's amazing to me, kids that are, 10, 11, 12 years old carrying their cell phones to school and, the video games and all these sorts of things. And, there are very powerful economic interests that don't really want sort of a full, robust discussion about the possible consequences of this huge shift in our culture, But I think, you don't have, it's just common sense, and I think that it's also a way in which we can make interesting alignments, make strange bedfellows where, it's like moral values are not, liberal or conservative. I think, there are certain things like advertising to children that you can get people across a wide, swath of political perspectives to agree on. And I think, some of those kinds of policy-oriented, systematic changes can have effect over the long run as well, and we have to be thinking creatively about things like that.
Okay, let's do two more questions. We'll get one here and then one from the seat here.
I guess this sort of goes along the lines of the idea of civil disobedience and all these small powered radio stations, making themselves accessible so that the public actually wants to continue having that. So I had to write this question down, so I made sure that I got it out correctly. But with the idea of media ownership in mind, what do you think about all the wireless hub activity going on? Making the internet accessible to low-income neighborhoods and rural areas that maybe like Comcast doesn't consider profitable. I think that there are communities and schools that are trying to set up these hubs around the country, free wireless hubs in their community. Is this actually sort of a radical way for people to take back ownership into their own hands, allowing everyone to maybe turn on the internet just like the radio, and i.e. smaller local radio stations on a national level, sort of like your Democracy Now! Or whatever? That's it. I'd like to know what you have to say about that.
I guess the short answer is it's all very good. Going into the future, there used to be this notion with telephones called universal service. There was this, when telephones were rolled out, there was this public policy goal. It was national priority. Everyone should have a telephone, right? And it had this universal service fund attached to your phone bill, because the idea was places that are rural weren't likely to get wired up for telephones because it was, it's going to be too costly to wire those up. Or low-income neighborhoods and such. They're not going to get a telephone because, the phone company is not necessarily thinking they're going to make the most profit off of it. The tragedy of the new broadband age is that whole notion of universal access and service is being lost. It doesn't really exist in law. And in fact, a lot of the mechanisms that used to feed into a universal service type fund to make sure that you not only had a phone, but these days it's becoming vital for you to have a broadband internet connection to enter the job market these days. It's becoming vital, yet all the ways that we used to fill this fund, to make sure that neighborhoods were wired, to make sure that rural areas were, had access to means of communication, period. It's being lost, and we need to find that again. And indeed, the initiatives like you're talking about, where communities are taking this into their own hands, Philadelphia being a great example, where Philadelphia sat back and decided, the only 50% of our city is wired. We're tired of this, so we as a city are going to put up a big Wi-Fi mesh over the city, and everyone's getting it. You're going to get either free or you're going to get it at low charge. This is a marvelous idea. This whole idea that the access to the web is not a luxury for the rich. It's something that everyone needs. It should be a utility like electricity or water. Now, these are popping up around the country, but it's being fought hardcore by folks like Verizon. Verizon in Pennsylvania had a twin bill racing through the State House and State Senate that passed, that ultimately, when it was signed by Governor Rendell, allowed for Philadelphia to happen. But any other city in Pennsylvania now that wants to set up a similar Wi-Fi system because they're tired of waiting for Comcast to get, or Verizon or anyone else to do it, they have until 2006 to set something up, and after that they are not allowed to actually update it for the times. It is enforced legislated obsolescence, and this is what we're up against across the country. So
it's really cheap and easy to do, isn't it, to set these up?
Well, these are tremendously cheap things. Absolutely, yeah. These barely cost. Wi-Fi access requires just computer, a card, and someplace to get the internet from. Absolutely.
Why don't we do our final question of the night?
Well, I just wanted to point out the obvious, sort of, and mainly basically to our panelists here, that this is a really unique group of people in the sense that we are media consumers, all of us, but we're also, most of us, going to be media professionals. And that's sort of, I think it's really important to understand that this is where it starts right here. I know that there's a lot of classes at Emerson where we're being taught how to be part of the mainstream media. We're being taught how to advertise to people so that they sit there and watch. we're being taught all of these things that all of us in this room are talking about right now, of maybe not wanting to be a part of. It's our job to also make the school understand, and not just this school, but all schools who are training people to go into the media, that we also want to be taught how to create an independent media. We also want to be taught how to build these movements, because this is part of the media too. This is arguably even more important part of the media. And so I just wanted to see if any of you guys have comments on concrete steps that students like us in media schools who are, learning how to be media professionals, what we can do to make sure that we learn everything and not just everything we need to know to go into the mainstream media, but everything we need to go into media in general, because media includes independent media as well.
Yeah, support S.C.A.M.M. One of the things that I think students need to really understand is the power of their unitary action. That's something that's been lost. One of the things that pains me the most in the classroom is to hear students say, "Wow, I don't know that there's anything I can do. Boy, we just can't do anything anymore." And it's like, no, wait a minute. No, students have always been at the forefront of positive social change. Always been at the forefront, students and youth. But that comes through organization and, again, hard work. And just like you're saying, you have to be the ones, because also you're the ones that come with the wallets into the schools. It's not about me, the teacher. It's about you, the student. And you get to say, this is what I want to pay for. Okay, that's something you can do, but you have to come with a number of people behind you. I remember, at my college, New England Institute of Art, there was an uprising at one point. I remember, certain people stormed into the president's office one year, and things got changed and things got moved around, things like that, So, those kinds of things are possible, but I think you really do need to stay organized. You need to be able to build S.C.A.M.M, to be even stronger, not only be, media professionals, but remember that you have to create relationships with your viewers, because you're not going to be anywhere without them. And we have to, be about educating our viewers to the things that you want to show them. Okay, and you've got to convince them, just like Coca-Cola convinces us that we should drink that swill, every day. And we do, and if they can get us to do that, we can do anything, all right? If we can be convinced to drink that stuff on a regular basis, and even for breakfast, we can convince ourselves of anything. I know that, all right? So, right. So, thank you. Well, I needed to get that out. So you just have to continue this process that's already in place. I have to say that I came to Project Think Different because I wanted to start an organization just like this at New England Institute of Art. When I saw Project Think Different doing what it was doing, I said, oh boy, I don't have to reinvent the wheel. But I'm really happy that students are creating this organization and that you're concerned about mass media and that you're doing something about it. Keep it going. This is it. Keep it going.
And to add, if there's this nagging feeling within you that there's something professors need to give you in order to continue this, I'd almost stress that you need to realize that you're not alone in this. As producers, there are others out there like you that are every bit as concerned, and that you're almost going to learn more in this regard. Like, take what you can from Emerson, but you're going to learn more by doing with others and linking up with other groups and keeping in touch with folks who are very strong and regionally based, like Media Tank in Philadelphia and elsewhere. Link up with these folks and be very open and free with your information, because you're going to learn more about this through each other than you ever will in a classroom.
Closing for us?
All right. Well, I think that I don't know if you were specifically suggesting this, but what I got from your question was, really a terrific suggestion for trying to influence the curriculum for your department. And I think that, you certainly could, I don't know what classes you have here, if there is anything that's, analysis of media systems or comparative media, or, I don't know how much you're reading Marshall McLuhan or Noam Chomsky or whatever, but I think that, if you do sort of a survey of the courses that are available and you find it really lacking in terms of some of these critical ways of looking at media, then you band together and you go to the department and you have that cohesion and you advocate for what it is that you want. And I think also that it's exciting to see this many of you in a room and to recognize that you're also most of you are communications majors. I mean, I've been sort of plodding along trying to work at student organizing at the University of Pennsylvania, and I guess I shouldn't really disparage a department, but I will. I felt there's just this kind of like, oh yeah, we'd like to come to that meeting, but we have the department happy hour today, and so there's like this kind of there is the analysis, there's the intelligence, we recognize this, but there's also this much greater imperative for academic success and achievement, within this, communications field, whether it's academics or moving into the profession. And I think, it's really great to see communication students, particularly, who seem to have a sort of commitment to this point of view and these issues. And I think, keep it going, keep it strong, and you're really poised to be leaders in a very significant way, because I think, as you were saying, students have throughout history played a role, very an influential role in the development of social movements, and it's one thing that is lacking at this point in the media reform movement is a really organized student presence. So, keep it going, create a really viable model for other students at other campuses, and, share what you're doing and connect with other students, and come to the Free Press Media Reform Conference in St. Louis this May and talk to other students, and what you do that's successful here or what you hear about that's successful on another campus, try and replicate that. If you unite with other students at other campuses and really push for curriculum development in the way that you're talking about, then you're having even a greater impact. And just to finish up, find those people that can be your allies. Talk to D.D. Halleck, or talk to people at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, or talk to people at Democracy Now!, or people who are sort of practitioners or theorists or critics in a way that you find consonant with your values and who have a long experience doing this work, and say, hey, well, this is what we're interested in, can you help us? Because they're very willing to help, and I'm sure they'd be excited to hear about what you're doing.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. This is such a successful